of the board of the Resource Center for the Arts, and most recently, I know that he provided a great service to Gower Street United Church by writing biographies of the many members of Gower Street United Church who served in the Great War. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program Mr. Bert Riggs. Hello, Bert.
Hello, Karl. Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome, sir. And it's great to see you again. Now, Bert, let's talk about Grand Bank. What was it like growing up in Grand Bank in the 1960s?
It was quite a different time than growing up in Grand Bank today. I was thinking about it, and the thing that sticks in my mind most was how busy the harbor was. There was the Bonavista Cold Storage fresh frozen fish plant, which had a number of, in the beginning, side trawlers, but later the first stern trawler in Newfoundland, the Grand Monarch. There was still masted schooners going to the deep sea fishery, and there was an inshore fishery. And one of the things that I remember very fondly from my growing up was in the summertime, because Newfoundlanders, as you are fully aware, referred to the noontime meal as dinner, the 6 o'clock meal as supper, and the one before you go to bed as lunch.
That's right.
Right? So I would come in around 11:30 or so, and my mother would say, "Go down and see if anybody's in." And she gave me 50 cents. And then 50 cents was a single coin. And that meant to go down and see if any of the inshore fishermen had come in, and to buy a fish, a 50-cent worth fish, fresh, gutted, but head still on, for my father's dinner. And usually there was, and I would bring it home. And my mother, you know, she died a little over 2 years ago, no, under 2 years ago, at the age of almost 99. But she was beyond and ahead of her time, because she seldom fried anything, and there was no salt shaker on our table. She salted the food to the degree that she felt was necessary, and that was it. And a fresh cod was steamed with potatoes and onions in the oven. And my mouth waters whenever I think of that.
I bet, yeah.
That's part of it. I went through the old United Church school system from K to 8, then went off to John Burke, where I had a very productive 3 years. During my middle year, I was elected editor of the school newspaper, so there's one of my first introductions to writing other than schoolwork. And the editor was none other than the Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland, Judy Hood.
Oh,
she and I became great friends at that time, and have remained so ever since. I left to go to university, and except for the following summer after my first year, I've not been there any more than for, you know, short vacations in the last, what, 40, almost 50 years.
Where did your love of literature and history and writing come from, do you think? Was it inherited? Was your father a great reader, your mother?
My mother was a great reader, but it was my own insatiable urge for information. Mainly, I read an awful lot. Like, we had that world history in grades 10 and 11, the big red book, you may remember.
I do. Yeah.
And we did half of it in grade 10 and half of it in grade 11. Well, by the end of the first month in grade 10, I had the whole thing read. Because I was voracious for that type of information. We had a public library, but remember, this was the day when you got 1.5 channels on a black and white TV.
Yes.
And so I used our local library, and people gave me books as gifts at Christmas and birthdays and things. And, you know, I remember reading Gone with the Wind when I was about 14 and was fascinated. And well, A was the fact that people were amazed that I'd read something that was over 1,200 pages, you know? So that was part of it. Then when I got to Memorial, I found that I really enjoyed the English courses that I was doing, and it sort of stuck with me there. And so I ended up majoring in English, but with a minor in history and political science. And again, the urge to learn. My interest in writing developed as a fluke almost, in that I got a job after university working with J.R. Smallwood on the Encyclopedia of Newfoundland project. And I worked there for 3 years until he had to close it down. And actually it was because of working there that I ended up working at Memorial. We did a lot of research at the Center for Newfoundland Studies in the old Henrietta Harvey Library building. And I got to know the staff of that building. By the time I ended work with the encyclopedia, they were in the QE2 library, and they had gotten this year-long grant to hire people to organize the papers that Smallwood had given to the university when he retired from politics. And I said, well, I don't know anything about being an archivist. And they said, well, you've worked in an archives. I said, yes. They said, we can tell you what you need to know about an archives. We can't tell somebody else what you know about Smallwood.
Right.
So basically, I went there because of my subjective knowledge rather than my technical knowledge. And I discovered quite happily that I found my niche.
Do you have an interesting story about working with Joey Smallwood that you can relate?
Yes. Mr. Smallwood loved Bristol cream sherry.
Yes.
Jeff Sterling, his good friend, used to give him a case every Christmas.
Oh.
But Smallwood was very much a Methodist, right? So he would pop his head in around my office door and he'd say, has the sun crossed the yardarm yet, Mr. Riggs? Because he would not take a drink before the sun crossed the yardarm, which was 12 noon.
Right.
And then he would go and have a couple of glasses of sherry with his lunch. So I enjoyed performing that function because he used to refer to me as his fellow Methodist.
Right. Bert, while we have some time, I would like to, since you've been writing and researching Newfoundland history for so many years, I'd like to pick your brain, if I may, about some of the famous personages Newfoundland has produced over the years. First, can you tell me anything about John Anderson? He was a Newfoundland politician, and he had some connection with daylight saving time.
John Anderson was originally from Saltcoats in Scotland, came here and married a local woman, a Murray, and came here first as an employee with Baird's, and eventually established his own company. And he got interested in politics and the betterment of the community, as it were, so he was elected and served 4-year terms on both the St. John City Council and in the House of Assembly at the same time. And then he was appointed to the Legislative Council, which would have been the Newfoundland equivalent in those days of the Senate. And he served there until about late 1920s. And it was during that time that he spearheaded the bill through the introducing it in the upper chamber, the Legislative Council, with the support of the Premier, and it went through the House of Assembly and became law to introduce daylight savings time to Newfoundland, the first place outside of England that enacted daylight saving time.
Isn't that
And
interesting?
he saw it as a way to utilize those extra hours of sunlight that were available during that time of the year, making it so that people weren't, that it wasn't sunrise at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. And now, of course, it's an international
Yes.
event,
yes.
isn't it?
Except in Saskatchewan.
Right. Except in Saskatchewan. Now, he had a couple of sons who went on and achieved international fame. I suppose the one who achieved most fame was John Murray Anderson.
Yes.
Tell us about John Murray Anderson.
John Murray Anderson was the older of the two. He was born in 1894. And he was educated first at Bishopfield College, and then he went off to Edinburgh and finished his education, formal education, at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And when he came back, he, as many Newfoundland young males did at the time, young women too, he went off to New York, where he saw what he thought an opportunity in the antiques trade. So he came back and he filled up a couple of containers with antiques that he had gotten around Newfoundland and went back to New York, where his business turned out to be a flop, surprisingly. But he did encounter people from the theater industry in New York, which has always been the home of great theater in the United States, Broadway, and he ended up becoming a Broadway impresario, in a sense, of producing various, particularly musical shows on Broadway. When Florence Ziegfeld, the great Follies producer, died, he was brought in to replace him. The Ziegfeld Follies was a yearly show. He, with a partner, opened a training school for young aspiring actors and actresses, and three that come to mind that he taught were Joan Blondell,
Wow.
Lucille Ball,
Wow.
and the one that became his lifelong friend, Bette Davis.
Amazing.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. He went off to Hollywood and produced a number of motion pictures out there, and he married, but there were no offspring. And in fact, he married, I think, a Bartlett from Newfoundland. And he died around 1954.
Did he do any performing himself?
No, he was never on the stage himself.
Ah.
No.
Always behind the scenes,
Always
producing
behind
or
the
directing,
scenes.
I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, his brother, Hugh Abercrombie Anderson, he became a theatrical luminary himself, didn't he?
Yes, he had started out following the course of Bishop Field, Edinburgh, Lausanne, with as his brother had done. He was 6 years younger. He is born around 1900, and he came back and was working in his father's business for a while, and the war broke out, and he attempted to enlist, but his eyesight was so bad that he was turned down. However, since he was of the upper class, that was usually no stumbling block. So what happened was he ended up being admitted to the regiment as the payroll officer in the headquarters of the regiment in London. And he served there for the duration of the war. He received an MBE, the Military Order of Merit, for his war service. And if you went through the records that have survived, and quite a lot of them have, of the members of the Newfoundland Regiment, there is hardly a personnel file there that does not have a letter, Dear Hughie.
Wow.
Because everyone in St. John's would have known him, and particularly, there would have been the Dear Captain Anderson ones from the lower classes, but, the heirs and those families all referred to him as Dear Hughie. And the Dear Hughie letters to him and his responses, I think, would make a very interesting study on class and involvement by those young, educated men in the regiment and in the war.
Margaret Dooley.
Before we step up, he wrote a book. He wrote a number of plays that his brother produced, because after the war he went to Broadway too, and he wrote a book about his brother, a biography called Out Without My Rubbers, which was a quite interesting book, and I believe that Smallwood brought him back in '61 as one of the many Newfoundlanders who made good abroad that were brought back for the opening of Memorial University.
Interesting.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, out without my rubbers, meaning out without my galoshes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Margaret Dooley wrote several books, The Eyes of the Gull, Cold Pastoral, and others. She was regarded by many as being Newfoundland's first novelist. And I venture to say not very many people out there even know her name or have heard her name. Can you tell us a little bit about Margaret Dooley?
Sure. Margaret Dooley was the daughter of Thomas Dooley, who was he was either from, I don't remember, who was Scotland. I think it was the north of England he was from. Came out here and started a business. Married Tryphena Soper of Carbonear, and they had 5 children. Margaret was one of 2 girls. She was born, I think, in 1894. She had a sister, Gladys. Then there was Cyril, who is the father of Dr. Margot Dooley, which is the only descendant with the Dooley name. Gladys had some children in North Carolina. Cyril fought in the war, was severely injured.
Yes.
Carried shrapnel around in him for the rest of his life. He died in the 1950s. Lionel was killed a few weeks before the war ended. And the 3rd brother was turned down because of a heart condition for service and got white feathered by some well-meaning young woman. That was a program where there was this program that if women saw able-bodied young men walking around the streets who weren't in uniform, they considered them to be shirking their duties, and they would go up to them and pin a white feather in their lapel as a symbol of cowardice without knowing the reason they weren't in uniform. Margaret had gone off to England after completing schooling here and spent some time at the Academy of Dramatic Arts there, and perhaps with the intention of becoming an actress. But the war brought that to a close, and she came back to Newfoundland, where she spent the war period and the period following the war doing good works, as it were. She had been planning to marry a young man who lived on the same street that she did. His name was Baird. And he had been injured in the war, and he died on the same day that his only sister got married. And the story is told how Margaret watched the funeral procession come from their house at Clifton down past her house on Rennie's Mill Road to his final resting place. She began publishing books, novels. Writing was an interest of hers in the mid-1930s. The first one, as you mentioned, was The Eyes of the Gull, then Cold Pastorelle, Highway to Valor, and Novelty on Earth. Those were the 4 that were published. But the thing, while there were other people in Newfoundland writing novels before her, hers were the first that were published internationally.
Right.
She was published by Macmillan in Canada, she was published by Macmillan in the United States, and she was published in England. And in fact, Novelty on Earth was translated and published in a Swedish edition. The 5th novel, which she had entitled Octaves to Dawn, was sent to her publisher, and it came back from the new editor that she had been assigned. And I guess she was a little not used to criticism or whatever, but she was so upset by the comments and notations on the manuscript that she threw it in the fireplace.
Oh my gosh.
A few pages have survived. They're with her material at the archives.
Wow.
But she never wrote another novel after that.
Wow.
She did, however, during that period, which is the early 40s, write 2 short stories, Sea Dust, which was about the Second World War, and what I consider to be her most perfect piece of writing. It's called Motherboggan. It was a short story that appeared in Fort Lightning magazine. It's about a young man who was what today we would probably call attention deficit syndrome. Growing up in a Newfoundland outport in the late 1890s, early 1900s. His father is never in the picture, so he could have been lost at sea while the chap was still a child. And his mother dies in summer of 1914, and he's at loose ends because she told him everything to do, from when to get up, when to go to bed, when to brush his teeth, how to tie his laces, when to come in for meals, his right from his left. And now there was no one to tell him what to do until a recruiting officer came around, and he enlisted because here was someone who was telling him what to do. And he goes off to the war. He's at Beaumont Hamel, she says, Dooley writes, where Newfoundlanders fell like 9 pins, which I thought was a very interesting turn of phrase there. But he's never wounded, never hit, nothing. Because the moment that something's about to happen, his mother says in his head, Joel, come here. And he moves, and the shell lands behind him, which is a very interesting. So he comes back, he ends up at the end of the war appearing before a British medical board who assumed that he was suffering from what was then called soldier's hurt, post-traumatic stress disorder, because they didn't believe that any recruiting officers would allow someone with that physical and mental condition to enlist freely. So they granted him a life pension, which was £60 a month, I think it was. And so he goes back to his old outport, where he soon becomes the richest man in the community. But the one thing that he wants, which is companionship, he can't get, because he's got this sagging jaw and this reputation, and all the young girls that he asks to marry him say no. And I won't give the ending away.
No, but
it's a fascinating story. I teach it in.
You've made me want to read it.
Yeah, I teach it in my English course at Memorial.
Yeah, great.
And students like it.
I think we've got time for one more, and this one is really interesting to me, because when I was a kid, I used to listen to a program on CBC on Sundays, and let me see if I can remember it. It was hosted by a lady from London, England, and it started calling from Britain to Newfoundland. Hello, Newfoundland. Her name was Margot Davies. What's the story of Margot Davies?
Well, we've got to go back to the father again. Margot Davies' father was David Davies, David J. Davies, and he came out to Newfoundland as trade commissioner from the British government to Newfoundland. Trade was a major interchange between Britain and Newfoundland at the time. And he was here for, must have been 30 odd years. Margot and her sister were both born here in the 1920s. And then he moved back to England, and both the girls went over there. And her sister eventually married someone who was either knighted or a lord, because she became Lady Baggy. And Margot never married, but she became involved with the BBC. She was a writer of fair repute, but it was this program, Calling Newfoundland from England, or from Britain, whichever, that in a sense endeared her to the Newfoundland troops in the Second World War and to the people here, because she was speaking directly to them. But more than that, this was not some limey with a British accent. This was Margot Davies from St. John's, that a lot of them knew when she was a little girl. And so she became quite the personality, the favored personality here, and her program went on well into the 1960s.
Oh, absolutely, because as I said, I certainly remember it.
Yeah. She was, it was interesting that George Wilson Knight came here. He was a British literary critic, made friends with her in England.
He was a Shakespeare expert, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yes.
And they became friends, and he came here to receive an honorary degree from Memorial in about 1982, and brought with him a sheaf of her poetry, which he left at the library. It's in the archives where I worked. But also he arranged for these poems to be published. And that's the only part of her literary opus that has survived, which is really unfortunate, because the poems are quite good, and if you can come across a copy in a secondhand bookstore, I would say get it.
Bert, we don't have very much time left, but before we go, one final question. You've pored over so many documents and artifacts, throughout your career. Is there one artifact, one physical document that you saw that just kind of bowled you over, and that you've always remembered and appreciate having seen it with your own eyes?
Yes, there's not one. A couple that popped to mind, if you don't mind, is what we call, is cataloged as the Carolyn Withers album of watercolors. It was an album, I think it's 43 watercolor paintings of St. John's in the late 19th century. And it was done by the famous artist of his day, William Frederick Rennie, for Carolyn Withers as a wedding present. And it is beautiful because it's scenic of the old St. John's. And there are pictures there from before the fire. There's pictures of Oxenpond Road. There's pictures of St. Thomas's Church, of Government House, from various vantage points that you couldn't get now because they're all built up. So that is one that I really love.
Well, thanks so much for being on the program, Bert.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great chatting with you. And perhaps someday we'll have you back.
Well, I
to talk
appreciate
more.
that, sure.
Bert Riggs, ladies and gentlemen, and that's it for this edition of Karl Wells' Point to Point. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for a variety of products, home-style breads, sandwiches, plus check out our freshly baked artisan breads and single-serve desserts exclusively at our in-store bakery on Frecker Drive. With 25 locations, wherever you go, there we are.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.